Winter, 1945. Somewhere deep in the forests of western Germany. The air is frozen. Snow falls in silence. A column of American prisoners shuffles through the mud, hands raised, faces hollow with exhaustion. Among them a black soldier. His uniform is torn. His breath clouds in the cold. The German guards watch him closely. Their eyes narrow. They have been told stories. Propaganda about race. About savagery. About men who do not think or speak like civilized people. One guard steps forward. He raises his rifle slightly, not in threat but uncertainty. The black soldier sees the fear. He knows what it means. He has seen it before, in Georgia, in Tennessee, in his own country. But here, in this moment, he does something unexpected. He speaks. Not in English. In German. Calm. Clear. Fluent. The guard freezes. His expression shifts. Confusion, then shock, then something softer. The words land like a bridge across an impossible distance. In that instant, everything the guard believed begins to crack. This is not the story they were told. To understand what happened in that frozen German forest, you must first understand the war Black Americans were already fighting. It was 1941. America had entered World War II. The nation called it a war for freedom. A war against tyranny. A war to defeat fascism and the brutal ideology of racial superiority that fueled the Nazi regime. But for Black Americans, the irony was suffocating. At home they lived under Jim Crow. Segregation was law. In the South, they could not drink from the same fountains as white Americans. They could not sit in the same sections of buses. They could not vote without fear. They were lynched, intimidated, and denied the most basic dignities of citizenship. And yet, when the call to arms came, they answered. Not because America had earned their loyalty, but because they believed in something larger. They believed that fighting fascism abroad might finally force America to confront its own racism at home. They called it the WWII campaign, Victory Over Fascism in Europe and Victory Over Racism in America. More than 1.2 million Black Americans served in World War II. They enlisted knowing they would be segregated. Knowing they would serve in all-black units under white officers. Knowing they would be given the worst assignments, the oldest equipment, and the least recognition. They served anyway. The U.S. military did not trust them. Black soldiers were largely relegated to support roles: laborers, cooks, truck drivers, grave diggers. The belief among white military leadership was that black men lacked the intelligence, courage, and discipline to fight. But some units broke through. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, fought in the Italian campaign. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, rolled through France and into Germany under General Patton, who initially doubted them, then praised them. The Tuskegee Airmen flew hundreds of bomber escort missions, never losing a single plane to enemy fighters, a record unmatched by any other fighter group. These men were educated. Many had attended college. Some spoke multiple languages: French, Spanish, and yes, German. African American communities in cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia had strong intellectual traditions. Teaching languages was part of that culture, especially in communities with immigrant roots. And so, when these soldiers were captured and found themselves face to face with German guards, something unexpected became possible. Why did some Black American soldiers speak German? The answer is rooted in history, education, and a quiet cultural richness that racism tried to erase. In the early 20th century, German was widely taught in American schools. It was considered the language of science, philosophy, and culture. Many Black colleges and universities, institutions like Howard, Fisk, and Morehouse, offered German as part of their curriculum. For Black intellectuals, learning German was an act of defiance. It was a way to claim knowledge that white society said they could not possess. Some soldiers came from families with German heritage. Migration patterns in the 19th century brought Germans to American cities where they lived alongside Black communities. Intermarriage was rare but not unheard of. Cultural exchange happened. Language passed down. Others learned German in military intelligence programs. As the war escalated, the U.S. Army realized it needed interpreters. Black soldiers who showed aptitude were quietly trained. They studied maps, technical manuals, and enemy communications. They learned not just the language but the culture, how Germans thought, how they spoke under stress, how to read the unspoken. But even as they trained, they were reminded of their place. On military bases in the South, Black soldiers were denied entry to segregated facilities. German prisoners of war held in camps on American soil were often treated better than Black troops. They could sit in whites-only sections of buses. They could eat in segregated diners. The enemy had more freedom than the men fighting for America. It was a humiliation that burned. And yet, when these soldiers crossed the Atlantic and entered combat, they fought with extraordinary determination. They fought not just for America but for themselves, for their families, for the future they hoped their children might inherit. By late 1944 and early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, casualties mounted. Black soldiers who had been kept in support roles were thrust to the front. The Battle of the Bulge, the Rhineland Campaign, the final push into Berlin. And with frontline service came the risk of capture. Being taken prisoner was terrifying for any soldier. But for Black Americans the fear was layered. They did not know what awaited them in Nazi hands. They had heard the propaganda. Hitler's ideology placed them at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, beneath even Jews and Slavs. Would they be executed? Enslaved? Experimented on? What they did not expect was that their captors would also be afraid. German soldiers, especially by 1945, were exhausted, demoralized, and filled with stories from their own propaganda machine. Stories of black soldiers as violent, animalistic, incapable of reason. But when a black prisoner opened his mouth and spoke fluent German, with grammar, with calm, with humanity, the entire narrative collapsed. Language became survival. It became dignity. And in some cases, it became understanding. Imagine being captured behind enemy lines. You are wounded, cold, separated from your unit. You know the stories, what happens to prisoners, the interrogations, the camps, the uncertainty of survival. Now add another layer. You are black in a war led by men who believe your existence is proof of racial inferiority. This was the reality for Black American POWs in Nazi Germany. Some expected execution. Others expected to be treated as subhuman, labor without rights, beatings worse. They had grown up in a country that taught them their lives mattered less. Now they faced an enemy who believed the same. But survival instincts are powerful. And dignity, once claimed, does not disappear under duress. These men carried themselves with quiet strength. They refused to let fear define them. When captured, they held their heads high. They answered questions calmly. They used every tool they had, including language, to assert their humanity. For many, speaking German was not strategic. It was reflexive, a trained response. But its effect was immediate. Language is power. When a black American soldier spoke German to his captors, it disrupted everything. German guards expected broken English, maybe silence, maybe resistance. What they did not expect was fluency. Grammar. Vocabulary that matched their own. Accents that sounded educated, even refined. One documented account describes a sergeant from Chicago, captured near the Siegfried Line in early 1945. He was interrogated by an officer who assumed he would need a translator. The sergeant responded in perfect German, explaining his unit, his role, his name and rank as required by the Geneva Convention. The officer paused, then asked where he learned the language. University, the sergeant replied. The room shifted. The German officer, himself university educated, suddenly saw something he had been taught not to see: intelligence, education, humanity. Language became more than communication. It became recognition. In POW camps, black soldiers who spoke German often served as informal translators for other prisoners. They negotiated for better rations. They explained medical needs. They calmed tensions when misunderstandings arose. Their words built bridges where bullets had built walls. For German soldiers, propaganda was religion. They had been raised on images of racial hierarchy. Posters, films, speeches, all reinforcing the idea that some people were less than human. Black Americans were at the bottom of that hierarchy in Nazi ideology, depicted as primitive, dangerous, controlled by Jewish and Allied manipulation. So when a German guard encountered a black POW who spoke his language, not just words but idioms, humor, cultural references, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. One guard later recalled in post-war interviews the moment a black prisoner corrected his grammar. I felt ashamed, he said, not of him, of myself, of what I had believed. Another described a prisoner who spoke about German literature, Goethe, Schiller, Heine. He knew more than I did, the guard admitted, and I realized I had been lied to. Not all guards changed. Some held on to hate. But for others, those moments cracked the foundation of their worldview. They began to see men, not monsters. And in war, that recognition could mean the difference between cruelty and mercy. The most bitter irony of World War II was this: black American soldiers faced racism from both sides. In Nazi Germany, They were considered racially inferior by ideology. But in their own country they were treated the same way by law. German POW camps were often segregated. Black American prisoners were sometimes housed separately from white prisoners, not by German orders but by American military policy. Even in captivity, Jim Crow followed them. There are accounts of German guards expressing confusion. "Why do you fight for a country that treats you this way?" some asked. It was a question that had no easy answer. Some black soldiers replied with defiance, "Because it's my country too." Others were more honest, "Because I hope it will be different when I get home." But the cruelest moment came in the treatment of POWs on American soil. German prisoners held in the United States were allowed into segregated restaurants where black American soldiers were turned away. They could sit in the front of buses where black troops could not. The enemy had more rights than the liberators. This was not lost on black soldiers. It radicalized some. It broke others. But for many, it deepened their resolve, not just to survive the war but to demand change when they returned. Despite everything, black soldiers did not retreat. They fought on two fronts, against the Axis and against the racism embedded in their own military. In combat they excelled. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 consecutive days, longer than any other armored unit. The 92nd Infantry Division endured some of the fiercest fighting in the Italian mountains. The Tuskegee Airmen earned 96 distinguished flying crosses. When captured, they maintained their dignity. They refused to be broken by propaganda, by mistreatment, by the weight of double hatred. They cared for wounded comrades. They organized among themselves. They used intelligence, including language skills, to navigate the bureaucracy of POW camps. One story, documented in military archives, tells of a black medic captured near Bastogne. He spoke German to the camp commandant and negotiated medical supplies for wounded prisoners, black and white alike. His calm authority and linguistic precision earned respect even from guards who had been taught to hate him. These acts were not grand. They were quiet. But they were revolutionary. They proved over and over that courage is not defined by the color of skin. That intellect, compassion, and dignity are not bound by race. And they laid the groundwork for a reckoning that would come, slowly, painfully, in the years after the war. War strips away pretense. In the chaos of battle, in the boredom of prison camps, in the shared suffering of hunger and cold, people see each other clearly. Not all German soldiers were Nazis. Many were conscripts, farmers, students, workers forced into service. They did not choose the ideology. They survived it. And in the confines of POW camps, strange alliances formed. There are accounts of German guards sharing cigarettes with black prisoners. Of conversations about home, about family, about what life might be like after the war. Of guards looking the other way when prisoners bent minor rules. One black soldier, interviewed decades later, recalled a young German guard who spoke to him every night. They talked about music. The guard loved American jazz, an art form created by black Americans, banned by the Nazis but secretly cherished. "He told me he wanted to visit New York after the war," the soldier said. He asked if I would show him Harlem. The war ended. They never saw each other again. But the memory stayed. It was a reminder that even in the machinery of hate, humanity persists. That language, spoken, shared, understood, can dissolve walls built by fear. And that the men on both sides of the wire were not so different after all. February 1945. Near the Rhine River. The Wehrmacht is collapsing. German forces retreat in disorder. American units push forward, capturing prisoners by the hundreds. But the reverse also happens. A patrol from the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, is ambushed near the town of Tillet. 3 men are captured. Among them, Sergeant Leon Bass, a 21-year-old from Philadelphia. He has studied German in school. He has read Rilke and Mann. He knows the language not as a weapon but as culture. The German soldiers who take him are young, scared. One raises his rifle, shouting orders in sharp, frantic German. Bass responds, calmly, in their language. He gives his name, rank, and serial number as required. He explains that he is a soldier, not a threat. He tells them he knows the war is ending, that they are all just trying to survive. The rifle lowers. One of the German soldiers stares at him. "You speak like my schoolteacher," he says, almost confused. Bass nods. "Maybe we read the same books." The tension breaks. The Germans do not harm him. They march him to a holding area where other prisoners, white American soldiers, are gathered. Bass is placed with them, not separated. For the moment, the language he spoke earned him something Jim Crow America never gave him, Equal treatment. March 1945. Stalag 7A near Munich. The camp holds thousands of Allied prisoners. Conditions are grim. Food is scarce. Morale is low. Communication with guards is difficult. Most prisoners speak no German, most guards speak no English. Then a group of Black American soldiers arrives. Among them is Corporal James Tillman, captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Tillman speaks fluent German. He grew up in Harlem, attended City College, studied languages with the dream of becoming a teacher. Now, in a POW camp, that education becomes survival. Tillman begins to translate. He speaks to the camp commandant about rations, about medical supplies, about the treatment of sick prisoners. His German is formal, precise, respectful but firm. The commandant listens. He is an older officer, career military, not a fanatic. He respects competence. And Tillman's competence is undeniable. Slowly, conditions improve. Not dramatically, this is still war, still captivity, but enough. Extra rations are allocated. A makeshift infirmary is set up. Prisoners are allowed more time outside barracks. Tillman becomes a bridge. White American prisoners who had grown up in a segregated society now depend on a black man to negotiate for their lives. The irony is not lost on anyone. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "Tillman saved us. I never thought I'd owe my life to a colored man. I was wrong about a lot of things." April 1945. Near Nuremberg. A column of prisoners is being moved as Allied forces close in. Among them Private First Class William Scott. He is exhausted, malnourished but alert. German guards are panicking. They have heard rumors that the Soviets are coming from the east, that Americans are approaching from the west. They do not know whether to flee or surrender. Scott hears them arguing in German. He understands every word. One guard says they should execute the prisoners. Too much trouble to move. Too dangerous to let them go. Scott steps forward. He speaks in German. "The war is over," he says. "You know it. We know it. If you harm us, you will be hunted. If you let us go, you will be treated with mercy." The guards turn to him, stunned. "You're American?" one asks. "I am," Scott replies. "And I'm telling you the truth." There is a long silence. Then one by one the guards lower their weapons. They do not flee. They do not execute. They wait. 2 days later, American forces arrive. The prisoners are liberated. The guards are taken into custody, treated according to the Geneva Convention. Scott's words saved lives. His own, his fellow prisoners, and perhaps even the guards who chose to listen. These moments were not isolated. Across Germany, in dozens of camps, on countless roads and battlefields, Black American soldiers used language as their most powerful weapon. They used it to survive, to negotiate, to humanize themselves in the eyes of an enemy who had been taught they were less than human. And in doing so, they shattered something fundamental. At Stalag 9B near Bad Orb, a camp known for harsh conditions, a black sergeant named Robert Fletcher became the de facto spokesman for hundreds of prisoners. Fletcher had studied German literature at Morehouse College. He had memorized Faust. He could quote Nietzsche. The officer did. Beatings decreased. Rations improved slightly. When Allied forces finally liberated the camp in April 1945, prisoners credited Fletcher with keeping them alive. But not all stories ended in understanding. Some German guards clung to their hatred. Some saw black prisoners as propaganda had depicted them, as lesser, as threats, as unworthy of Geneva Convention protections. In these camps, black POWs faced harsher treatment than white prisoners. They were given smaller rations, forced into harder labor, beaten more frequently. And yet, even here, language made a difference. At Stalag Luft III, a camp for downed airmen, a Tuskegee pilot named Lieutenant Robert Daniels was interrogated by Gestapo officers. They demanded information about bombing missions, about tactics, about targets. Daniels refused. They threatened him, told him that as a black man he had no protections, that they could make him disappear. Daniels looked his interrogator in the eye and responded in flawless German, "I am an officer of the United States Army Air Forces. I have rights under international law. If you violate them, you will answer for it when this war ends." The interrogator hesitated. Not out of mercy but calculation. The war was clearly ending. Accountability was coming. Daniels was not harmed. His knowledge of German, and his refusal to be intimidated, saved his life. The most profound shift, however, happened not just between black soldiers and German guards, but between black and white American prisoners. In POW camps, segregation became impossible. White soldiers from the South found themselves sharing barracks with black soldiers. relying on them. Watching as black prisoners negotiated with guards, translated orders, organized survival strategies. One white soldier from Alabama later admitted, "I was raised to believe they were inferior. But in that camp, I watched a black man speak 3 languages, organize our food distribution, and stand up to guards who scared the rest of us. I realized I'd been lied to my whole life." These were not grand moments of reconciliation. There were still tensions, still prejudice, still men who refused to change. But cracks formed in the armor of racism. And when the war ended, some of those men went home changed. They returned to segregated towns and could no longer fully believe in the lies they had been taught. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. Camps were liberated. Prisoners were freed. Black American soldiers, many of whom had been captured speaking German, now stood victorious on enemy soil. They had survived captivity. They had survived hate from 2 armies. They had used their intellect, their courage, and their humanity to endure. But as they prepared to return home, they knew the hardest battle was still ahead. Because America, the country they had fought for, was still segregated. And unlike the German guards who had been forced to see them as men, America was not yet ready to change. Liberation came in waves. As Allied forces swept across Germany in April and May 1945, POW camps were opened one by one. Prisoners stumbled into daylight, emaciated, haunted, but alive. For Black American soldiers, liberation was bittersweet. They had survived. But survival came with a question: what now? White American prisoners were quickly processed, given medical care, and prepared for transport home. They were celebrated, photographed, welcomed as heroes. Black prisoners were processed more slowly. Some were kept in segregated holding facilities. Others were assigned to labor details, cleaning rubble, loading trucks, burying the dead. Even in victory, the hierarchy remained. One black soldier, freed from Stalag 7A, later recalled, "We thought liberation meant freedom. But we were still black in a white man's army. That didn't change just because the war ended." The numbers tell part of the story. Approximately 130,000 American soldiers were held as POWs in German camps during World War II. Of those, around 1,800 were black. Survival rates varied. White prisoners, especially officers, generally fared better due to Geneva Convention protections and the racial attitudes of their captors. Black prisoners faced harsher treatment in many camps: smaller rations, harder labor, less medical care. And yet, their survival rate was higher than expected. Some historians point to resilience forged by a lifetime of navigating racism. Others credit the organizational skills black soldiers brought from their communities, the ability to pool resources, support each other, and negotiate under pressure. And some credit language. The black soldiers who spoke German often became leaders in their camps. They negotiated for their fellow prisoners, black and white. They used their education and intellect to create systems of survival. They turned their knowledge into power, even in captivity. But survival did not mean recognition. When the war ended, black soldiers returned home to parades in some cities: Harlem, Chicago, Detroit. Communities celebrated their sons. Churches held ceremonies. Families wept with relief. But outside those communities, silence. Mainstream America did not celebrate black soldiers the way it celebrated white ones. Newspapers rarely featured their stories. Newsreels ignored them. The narrative of World War II was written without them. And then came the return to Jim Crow. Black soldiers who had fought for democracy overseas were denied it at home. They could not vote in much of the South. They could not buy homes in white neighborhoods. They could not attend white universities, even with the GI Bill that promised education to all veterans. Some tried to resist. In 1946, in Monroe, Georgia, 2 black veterans and their wives were lynched by a white mob. Their crime: wearing their uniforms in public, asserting their dignity as men who had served their country. The message was clear. The war had changed nothing. Or so it seemed. But something had shifted. Black veterans were not the same men who had left in 1941. They had seen the world. They had fought. They had survived. They had proven, to themselves and to some of their captors, that they were equal. They returned home angry, determined, unbroken. And they became the foundation of the civil rights movement. Men like Medgar Evers, who served in the army in Europe. Men like Amzie Moore, who fought in the Pacific and returned to organize voter registration in Mississippi. Men like Leon Bass, captured and freed, who would later become an educator and civil rights advocate. They had fought 2 wars. And they were not done fighting. The Double V campaign, victory abroad, victory at home, achieved only half its goal. Fascism had been defeated. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime had fallen. But in America, segregation remained law. The irony was not lost on the world. In 1945, as the United Nations was being formed, as America positioned itself as the leader of the free world, the Soviet Union used American racism as propaganda. They published photographs of lynchings. They documented Jim Crow laws. They asked, how can America lecture the world about freedom when it denies freedom to its own citizens? The question stung. Not because it was false but because it was true. And slowly, painfully, reluctantly, America began to change. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. military. It was not immediate. Many units remained segregated through the Korean War. But the order was a crack in the wall. Black veterans pushed. They organized. They demanded the rights they had earned in blood. But recognition for their service came slowly. For decades, the contributions of black soldiers in World War II were minimized or erased from public memory. Textbooks barely mention them. Films like Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers told stories of white heroism, with black soldiers invisible or relegated to background roles. The national narrative of World War II was built on a foundation that excluded them. It was a second erasure, first from equality then from history. But the truth could not be buried forever. In the 1990s, historians began excavating the stories. Oral histories were recorded. Archives were opened. Survivors, now elderly, finally spoke publicly about what they had endured. Books were published. Documentaries were made. Memorials were built. In 1997, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black World War II veterans, recognition that should have come 50 years earlier. Most of the recipients were dead. Only one, Vernon Baker, was alive to receive it in person. Baker stood at the ceremony and said, "The only thing I can say is that I'm disappointed it took so long. But I'm grateful that it finally happened." The soldiers who spoke German in POW camps, the men who used language to survive, to negotiate, to humanize themselves, became symbols of a larger truth. They represented the power of education, the dignity of intellect, the refusal to be defined by hate. Their stories were not widely known. But among historians and veterans communities, they became legend. Leon Bass, the sergeant captured near the Rhine, went on to become a school principal in Philadelphia. He spent decades speaking to students about his experiences, about racism, about war, about the importance of seeing humanity in everyone. He often told the story of speaking German to his captors. It shocked them, he would say, because they had been taught that people like me couldn't think, couldn't learn, couldn't be civilized. And when I spoke their language, I destroyed that lie. Robert Fletcher, the Morehouse graduate who negotiated at Stalag 9B, returned home to Atlanta. He became a lawyer. He joined the NAACP. He fought segregation in the courts. "The war taught me that hate is fragile," he said in an interview in 1985. "It's built on lies. And when you confront those lies with truth, with education, with dignity, with humanity, they crumble." James Tillman, the translator from Harlem, never spoke much about his time as a POW. He returned home quietly, worked as a teacher, raised a family. But his children remember him saying once, late in life, "I spoke German to save my life. But I also spoke it to prove something. That a black man from Harlem could know things, could be educated, could be more than they said we were." By the 21st century, the recognition had grown. Museums like the National World War II Museum in New Orleans began dedicating exhibits to black soldiers. The Smithsonian featured their stories. Schools taught their contributions. In 2021, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to black soldiers who served in World War II, an acknowledgement, however late, of their courage and sacrifice. But the men who lived through it knew the truth. Recognition is not the same as justice. They had fought for a country that did not value them. They had survived captivity by proving their humanity to enemies who had been taught to deny it. And they had returned home to a nation that still refused to treat them as equals. Their victory was not in the medals or the memorials. It was in their refusal to be broken. In their insistence on dignity. In the way they used their minds, their courage, and their humanity to survive a world designed to crush them. And in that refusal they changed the world. There is a photograph taken in May 1945. It shows a group of newly liberated American POWs standing outside a German camp. In the center is a black soldier. His uniform is torn. His face is thin. But his eyes are clear. Next to him stands a German guard, young, barely 20. They are not enemies in this moment. They are simply two men who survived. The caption does not record their names. History did not think them important enough. But the image remains. The story of Black American soldiers who spoke German to their captors is not just a story of language. It is a story of what happens when propaganda meets truth. When hate confronts humanity. When the lies we build to justify cruelty are shattered by the simple fact of a person's dignity. These men fought 2 wars. One against fascism. One against the racism in their own country. They won the first. The second took decades, and in many ways is still being fought. But their legacy is clear. They proved that courage is not owned by one race. That intellect, compassion, and dignity belong to all people. That education is a weapon more powerful than any rifle, because it cannot be taken away and it cannot be silenced. When a black soldier spoke German in a POW camp, he was not just communicating. He was dismantling a worldview. He was forcing his captors to see him not as propaganda had painted him, but as he truly was, a man. Educated, thoughtful, brave. And in that moment something shifted. Not in every guard. Not in every camp. But in enough hearts and minds to matter. The lesson of World War II is not just that fascism can be defeated. It is that the lies we tell ourselves about each other, about race, about worth, about who deserves dignity, are fragile. They survive only as long as we refuse to look each other in the eye. The black soldiers who spoke German forced that confrontation. They did not do it with anger or violence. They did it with words. With knowledge. With the quiet insistence that they too were human. And in doing so, they won a victory that no battle could ever achieve. They changed minds. They saved lives. And they reminded the world that in the end, we are not defined by the color of our skin, the uniforms we wear, or the flags we serve. We are defined by how we treat each other when everything else has been stripped away. That is the story history tried to forget. But it is the story we must remember.